sharing some things with y'all. Brad and Carrie are flying back in tonight. They should be here close to now. So be praying for them as they continue to seek out God's will for their life. There's something else I was going to tell y'all. How many of you have gotten your D-Now brochures in the mail? Did you get them? All right, so make sure you start taking note of that and you start asking people and inviting them to come and sign up for D-Now as well. So hopefully it'll be a great time this year like it always is. Anyway, if you got your Bibles, turn to James chapter 1. For middle school, we've been going through the book of James. I know y'all been doing something totally different. But I'm going to try to catch you up because this week's lesson is just a continuation of last week's lesson. And last week, high school, what did we talk about last week? Sort of. Temptation. We talked about lust. Yeah, we talked about spiritual LSD, which is what? Lust, sin, and death. We're in James chapter 1. Last week we talked about verses 15 through 17. This week we're going to do 16 through 18, which is a continuation of last week's lesson, but it's really a continuation of what James has been writing all along. And what's the kind of main thing James has been talking about in verses 1 through 17 so far, or 15? About trials and tests. That's right. About God cannot tempt, where temptation comes from. How when you're tempted, you can't place the blame on anyone else other than who? Other than on yourself. And we talked about that, how in verse 14, it talks about how when you're carried away and enticed by your own lust. So that tells you exactly where the problem lies. So hopefully, middle school, if you don't have questions, just raise your hand and ask me. I don't want to assume that you know things, so don't be afraid to raise your hand. I will not make you come up here and do a test or anything. I'll just hopefully answer your question. But I'm going to try to catch you guys up as much as I can and continue moving forward. But like I said, tonight we're going to continue looking, and then as we go on next week and the week after that, which I know is spring break, but don't worry, we'll have it covered. I hope to maybe finish chapter 1, but it really is, the whole chapter is a continuation of this idea and this thought of enduring a test, enduring a trial, and seeing what God has purposed in it for you, and also not allowing that to turn into a temptation, or not allowing that to turn into you taking your eyes off God and giving into sin in your life, and then, going through that process of spiritual LSD, where it talks about lust leads you astray, and then it causes you to sin, and sin ultimately causes what? Death. All right, so if you will, we're going to read. I'm going to start back at verse 1, and we'll read down to verse 18. James chapter 1, it says, James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad, greetings. And consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But he must ask in faith without doubting, for the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For that man ought not to expect that he will receive anything from the Lord, being a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. But the brother of humble circumstances is to glory in his high position, and the rich man is to glory in his humiliation, because like flowering grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with a scorching wind and withers the grass, and its flower falls off, and the beauty of its appearance is destroyed. So too the rich man in the midst of his pursuits will fade away. Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised for those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted that I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. And then when lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. And do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. In the exercise of his will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, so that we would be a kind of first fruits among his creatures. So as you see in verse 16 through 18, it's kind of a continuation of last week. Hey, Kenny, do me a favor. On the light board where it says 2, slide that thing all the way up so that they're not sitting in the dark. Yeah, there you go. All right. Hopefully that'll help you out a little bit. But anyway, So really, we're going to see three simple things tonight, and they all start with the S, so you should be able to remember them. And I tried really hard to make this work. So the first one is stop, the second one is see, and the third one is show. So we're going to look for something that needs to be stopped. We're going to see really what and who, and then we're going to look for what is to be shown or what you're to show. I don't know if it's, I don't know. Somebody may need in the door. Oh, sorry. I don't think they did. I just see somebody peeking in the window and it bothers me. But the first thing we're going to see is stop. And it's real simple because it breaks down by verse. Verse 16, what does James say there in verse 16? Don't be deceived. Who's he talking to? All right, which is who? It's believers, but who's he specifically talking to? To Jews that had been what? To spread out. So that's who the whole book of James is written to. Just try to catch all of it. But it also applies to us because what do we have in common with those Jews? We're not Jewish. So that rules that out for most of us. We're believers just like they are. Okay? It's not a hard concept. We're believers just like they are. But what James is saying is telling them, hey, listen, don't be deceived. Or what he's really saying is kind of like what he said back in verse 13 is, hey, stop believing this way. In verse 13, if you go back up there, he's telling them, hey, don't let anybody continue to say their temptation comes from God. Like people were pushing blame off on God. Well, here he's saying, don't be deceived. And why is he saying don't be deceived? Because what was happening? They were being deceived. Yeah, it's real simple. It breaks down real easy. But they were being deceived, and really, honestly, what they were being deceived not only to where temptation came from and trying to place the blame somewhere, but they were being deceived as you read on in verses 17 and 18. They were being deceived of the character of God and who God is. And you know, it's kind of like if you go back to Genesis chapter 3. When Eve encounters the serpent and he begins to talk to her and try to convince her and does successfully convince her to eat of the apple and to eat of the tree that God had told him not to, what are some of the things that the serpent said to Eve? You'll be like God. All right, what's some other things? All right, you'll live forever. But what did he do? It's really, yeah, he tricked him. Here, flip over there. Right. In doing that, he's what?
He deceived her.
Yes, he deceived her. Hold on. I just want you to see this. The serpent in verse 4. Because he's asked Eve, hey, what did God tell you? And Eve begins to tell him, here's what God has said. And Eve even began to change the words that God had said. And then the devil began to change it too. It says, the serpent said to the woman, you will surely not die, or surely will not die. For God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be open, you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And then you begin to go on and you begin to see she fell for it and was completely deceived. And the whole concept of that is the devil began to deceive her of who God was and saying, well, your God doesn't love you because he's holding out on you. Because the reason he told you not to eat of this tree is not because it's for your benefit or he's looking out for you, just because he doesn't want you to be like him. And so Eve bought into that lie. And really what the problem was here is that these people were being deceived into, hey, here's the character of God. Your God is able to tempt you, and your God does these things to you so that he can hopefully, lead you astray or make you feel less, than who you are as a believer and make you struggle. Like God takes joy in that. And that's what they were being deceived by buying into was, instead of saying, hey, listen, this is coming from the devil because God can't tempt, and I'm falling for it. Instead of believing that, they were falling for this deception. They were falling for these lies. And what's interesting is that, especially with these people being Jewish, if you go and you read the history in the Old Testament, time and time again, who's the one that after the people of Israel have been deceived, after they've gone astray and wandered off on their own, who's the one person that's always reaching back out to them to bring them back in? It's God. It's not the devil. The devil's not telling them